Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the International Trade Center and the European Commission's Directorate-General for Trade for today's public seminar on applying a gender lens to the work and agreements of the WTO. My name is Edison Yap, Associate Economic Affairs Officer at the ITC's Women in Trade program, the She Trades Initiative. Before I begin, allow me to share a few notes and house rules. Note that this session will be recorded. We kindly request that you keep yourselves muted during the seminar. You may unmute yourselves during either of the Q&A segment, and when the moderator has called upon you to do so. Finally, we invite you to post your questions using the Q&A functionality on Zoom. You should find this at the bottom panel of your Zoom window. With that said, allow me to give you a very quick overview of the agenda. We'll begin first with opening and welcome remarks from Pamela Coconut-Hamilton and Madeleine Tuninga. Subsequently, we will have a presentation by Eugenia McGill and a Q&A moderated by Judith Fesihaya, and subsequently a panel discussion and a Q&A, including our experts who developed the four technical reports and moderated by Madeleine Tuninga. And finally, we have a closing remarks by Nicole Mensa from the WTO. Now, with that said, allow me to give the floor to Pamela, please.
Thanks so much, Edison, and it's really great to be here with everybody. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues, greetings and welcome to today's public seminar on applying a gender lens to the agreements and work of the World Trade Organization. I'm really delighted to be with you and grateful to our EU DG Trade partners for their financial support in making this research possible. I'm also really thrilled that we have such an esteemed group of experts with us for today's webinar. These include our EU colleague partner and co-moderator, Madeleine Tuninga, one of the two authors of our Gender Analytical Framework, Eugenia McGill, the authors of our technical papers, Birgit Viol, Kamala Dawar, and Michael Geist, and Nicole Mensa, Special Assistant and Advisor on Gender to the WTO Director-General. I'd also like to thank peer reviewers from the ILO, UNCTAD, WTO, the World Customs Organization, and the Public Procurement Research Center, and of course, ITC's own Judith and Edison for their guidance throughout this project and for organizing and moderating today's event. To help set the stage for today, I'll first give a brief recap of some of the events that brought us here. I'll then close with a short example of why conversations like the one we're having today matter for women entrepreneurs in practice. As you know, the WTO's 11th Ministerial Conference in Argentina saw an exciting development, the launch of the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. It was a landmark declaration. Supported then by 118 WTO members and observers, today we have 127 members and observers that have endorsed this declaration. There's now a WTO informal working group on trade and gender, which has made notable progress in deepening the knowledge base on the trade and gender nexus. We at ITC are grateful to have the opportunity to contribute to their efforts in developing a greater understanding of what a gender lens entails in the context of the WTO's work and the WTO agreements. When I first became a trade negotiator many years ago for my home country of Jamaica, I came to Geneva to take part in the Uruguay round negotiations that led to the establishment of the WTO. I don't think most of us would have imagined then that we'd be having this conversation. It's been a long road, and we know that there's more work to make it a trading system that's more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. And so this conversation is very important. But we also have to remember that conversations must lead to action. Last month's SDG Summit in New York reinforced that we're far from achieving the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including SDG 5 on gender equality. And our own research at ITC shows that we have a long way to go to ensure women-led and owned businesses have what they need to thrive. The working papers that have been published under the EU-funded project give us an even clearer picture of the challenges women face in trade and invite us to consider more critically how current trade rules impact women in the multiple roles they play as consumers, workers, care providers, and business owners. They also remind us that women are not a homogeneous group, but face a range of circumstances, challenges, and needs. and in many of the crucial areas for enabling women to participate and thrive in international trade. This research showed that we're not yet heading in the right direction. For instance, the evidence shows that the gender divide when it comes to internet access isn't getting better. In fact, we're seeing the gulf between developed and developing economies widen. This means less access to education and training. It means not being able to access mobile internet services. It means not being able to apply new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, to running a business or finding international buyers. And this means not being able to engage in e-commerce, which is crucial given the many roles that women are often juggling, which require flexibility. Though we must also keep in mind that this flexibility can come at a price, namely by further entrenching gender divisions of care and other responsibilities. That's just one example, but as we'll hear today, there are others. I look forward to your feedback on how our gender lens analytical framework and technical papers can help inform your work in applying a gender lens to both current and future WTO agreements, as well as the WTO's work overall. Thank you all, and I wish you a productive seminar.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for your remarks. Now let me give the floor to Madeleine Tuninga, Head of Unit, Multilateral Trade and Sustainable Development Policy, Green Deal, Conflict Minerals, Directorate-General for Trade at the European Commission, to give her welcome remarks. Madeleine, please.
Thank you so much, Edison, and my sincere thanks also to Pamela Koch-Hamilton for this excellent introduction, setting the scene and reminding us that indeed we've come from a long way, but we are not there yet. But I do think I was there when we were in MC11 with the first statement. The sensitivities around it, is it in the WTO, not in the WTO, the sort of separate photo that had to be taken, picture that had to be taken of ministers. If you look at where we are now, I think it deserves a congratulations to see how this has become a standing item, actually. Now, we are very, very happy to have been working with the ITC on this project. It's one of the many that we have in our relations. And I want to thank you also for the good cooperation, in particular Judith and Edison for their committed work. Certainly also a big thank you to the authors of the framework paper and the 4 thematic reports on e-commerce, government procurement, trade facilitation, and investment facilitation. These have been important contributions. Now, it is important that we have now come together for the webinar on this analytical framework and the 4 thematic reports, so that we can have a further exchange on it. The reports discuss a wide range of issues and raise a wide set of ideas and questions. Some points focus directly to the work of the WTO. For instance, the recommendation to include gender provisions in new WTO trade agreements. But the paper also indicates that the process of developing a gender lens for certain aspects of trade goes well beyond the agreement of the WTO. This is the case, for instance, for improving access to financial services and providing specific aid for trade. And we will need to look at that, and this also only underlines how important it is to be combining and seeing the interface between different policy areas and areas for action, and how we can bring that together. I look forward to the opportunity today to discuss the papers with the authors, as well as with the audience. And it will be really, really very useful to hear what points you find most interesting and relevant, and where you see scope for delving deeper. As you know, the EU is member of the informal working group on trade and gender in the WTO. And one of the 4 pillars of the work of this group is to explore the gender lens. To explore this concept and how this could usefully be applied to the work of the WTO. This has been one of the driving forces for us and factors to volunteer to take up on lead on this point and to partner with the ITC through this project. So we will report back from this webinar to the informal working group in the WTO and discuss that further there. We hope to discuss that then further. The reports and the webinars are a contribution and inspirations to our further work on trade and gender, and should be further discussed in the coming months and year. So with that, I want to conclude to say that I look very much forward to this webinar, and I give it back over to Edison.
Thank you very much, Pamela and Madeleine, for your opening and welcome remarks. Now, let us move to the presentation segment. And for that, allow me to give the floor to Judith Vesihaya, Head of the ITC She Trades Initiative at the International Trade Center, to take over. Judith, over to you, please.
Thank you, Edison. Good morning, good day, and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us here today. We are now jumping into the substantial part of the agenda. Let me thank the two authors of the Gender Framework, Marzia Fontana and Eugenia McGill, who are, Eugenia is here with us today to present the framework. Eugenia is a senior lecturer and co-director of the Economic and Political Development Concentration at Columbia University, where she's also co-chairs of the School Diversity Committee. As a lawyer and development specialist, her research and advisory work focus on gender and social policy issues in developing countries and gender and social inclusion strategies of development organizations. What we will do now is we will hear a comprehensive presentation from Eugenia. Of course, if you want to know more about the overall framework, we have shared the link to the papers. And then we will open for a Q&A. I invite you all to participate actively. We want to hear from you, comments, feedbacks, questions, and suggestions. So let me now give the floor to Jenny. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Judith. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of Marzia and myself, I'd like to thank ITC and the EU for all of their support of this initiative, and in particular for arranging this opportunity for us to share highlights of our work and to answer questions that those in the audience may have. First, I'll provide a brief overview of the overall objectives of the study and the scope and process. Looking at the objectives, we really had dual objectives in mind. The first was to come up with a framework that could help to maximize opportunities for trade agreements to promote women's economic empowerment and participation in trade-related activities. And here we were drawing on understandings of economic empowerment from theorists such as Naila Kabir and others, looking at empowerment as a matter of expanding the choices that women, especially marginalized women, can make in their own lives, and also expanding the range of livelihood options that they could choose from. This also recognizes, and this was also already mentioned in some of the opening remarks, the differences among men and women based on factors such as age, location, race or ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, and how these factors could affect the ability of women and men to participate in economic activities, including trade-related activities. Also, we take account of the fact that and promoting women's economic empowerment isn't just a matter of expanding inclusion of women, but also the terms of their inclusion, improvements in their inclusion in economic activities, including trade. The other part of our objectives involved ensuring that trade agreements and their implementation don't inadvertently undermine the national gender equality commitments that countries have made. This could involve, for example, undermining women's livelihoods in, for example, a sector such as agriculture, or reducing the policy space that governments have for future gender equality commitments or laws or programs they might be interested in promoting. Next slide, please, Edison. Thank you. So looking at what the scope of a framework focusing on the WTO might involve, we were asked to consider WTO functions, the range of WTO agreements, WTO negotiations, and also implementation, and also joint statement initiatives. Next slide. And looking more specifically at trade-related areas, we were asked to think about a framework that might involve attention to the negotiation process, if that's relevant, the structure and text of a particular trade agreement, implementation, enforcement, and review mechanisms, and also, as was already mentioned, complementary laws, policies, and programs that might go beyond the remit of a trade ministry, trade officials, but that would necessarily be important, for example, in the area of vocational education, access to finance, capacity building for small enterprise, that would be important to ensure that the benefits of trade measures and trade reforms are equitably shared. Next slide, please. The process of developing this framework involved 4 stages. In the first, we came together with our colleagues at ITC to brainstorm about what a framework might look like. And the goal was to develop a framework that would be flexible enough that it could be applied to a wide range of issue areas. In parallel, ITC was then identifying 4 possible initial topics on which to apply this framework as an initial pilot test. They engaged the 4, well, in fact, 3 technical experts for the 4 topics that they had developed, and you'll be hearing from each of them today, to do research and analysis on these topics and to see how this general framework could be applied to their areas of expertise. And they then, while we were developing a general analytical framework paper, they were preparing for technical papers that you now will be hearing more about today. And there were then ITC and EU organized 4 technical workshops with experts and delegates. Many of those in the audience may have participated in those. Those were very helpful to us in providing feedback on all these elements of the process. And finally, all of us finalized both the general framework paper and the 4 reports that you'll be hearing about today. Next slide, please. So when Marcia and I were working with Judith Edison and other colleagues at ITC, in developing a framework, we were taking into account the several decades of research and analysis on the gender implications of trade policies and activities. For example, considering the 2-way interaction between gender and trade, when you consider on the one hand, the ways in which gender inequalities can undermine trade performance. There's quite a bit of research on this, particularly in the area of agriculture. But on the other hand, ways in which changes in trade policy could differently affect men and women and different groups of men and women in terms of how they could benefit from those trade changes. And then we also considered the distributional impact of policies, and in particular 3 impact channels. One would be effects on employment, both wage employment and self-employment. The second would be trade effects on consumption in terms of changes in prices or the availability of goods and services. And the third would be impacts on public provision. This would involve trade measures that might be changing access to or the quality of public goods and services. And the third aspect we considered were the multiple roles of men and women and the different gender norms that apply to these and how those could have implications for the impact of trade policies. We considered women, for example, as workers, women as producers and business owners, women as consumers, women as unpaid care providers, and also women as users of public services. And we tried to build these different dimensions into the framework. Next slide, please. So coming down to looking at the framework itself, we identified 6 issue areas that we thought were best related to the WTO's work. And in each of these, as you'll see in our paper, we developed a set of questions that trade officials, trade analysts, and other practitioners could consider in applying this framework to their trade-related work. The 6-part framework is what we also asked the 3 technical experts to consider as the different lenses or sub-lenses that they would be applying to their particular area of expertise. And I would note that in revising our general analytical framework paper, we found it really helpful to take examples from each of these 4 technical areas and the work that the 3 experts had done to illustrate some of the insights that can be drawn from applying this framework across very specific trade areas. I'll say a few words about each of these 6 areas before the mic moves to our 4 experts for their perspectives. So the first element of the framework we suggest is an assessment of the potential gender effects of agreements and ongoing negotiations. And here we suggest both an economic and a legal perspective. The economic analysis would be very much along the lines of what I suggested in mentioning the 3 impact channels that we think are especially relevant in looking at gender and trade interactions. In terms of legal analysis, we would suggest looking at the negotiation process, the text of it and structure of a trade agreement, and the implementation mechanisms that are built in to a trade agreement, and applying a gender lens to each of those to consider the extent to which gender has or has not been considered or can be considered in the future, especially in terms of implementation. The second element of the framework we're suggesting is a consideration of the extent to which particular WTO rules, a WTO agreement, is consistent with a country's gender equality commitments. One area of particular concern that we asked the experts to factor into their analysis was, are there any aspects of the trade area that they're looking at that might have an impact on abilities of governments to enact new laws or measures to promote women's empowerment, for example, through subsidies, quotas, or other types of preferences? And the third area of analysis we suggest is to ensure adequate representation of the range of women's interests in a particular economy and in a trade area. And here, some of the representation that we recommend considering is the representation, first of all, of the National Ministry on Gender Equality or Women's Empowerment, women's business organizations, cooperatives, women's nonprofit organizations, both in the consultations around a trade reform, negotiations, and also implementation. Moving to the 4th area, we also suggest looking at ways in which implementation and monitoring of a particular trade agreement can have gender implications and how to maximize the gender benefits in the implementation of an existing agreement. Here we differentiated between what we would call direct and indirect or complementary implementation measures. The direct measures, and these would vary depending on the trade area, could involve looking at expanding the gender balance in the trade regulatory bodies that are relevant to that area, considering the types of review mechanisms that are in place and how gender can be better integrated into those, gender training and awareness raising, especially among trade officials, other implementation bodies for the trade area. And in terms of complementary laws and policies, I think this has already been mentioned, and I really appreciated this in the introductory remarks. This would be a consideration of complementary laws, policies, programs outside of the trade area that would necessarily be very helpful to ensure that women operating in trade-related activities could really maximize the benefits of their participation. It could involve access to digital services, skills training, capacity building of various sorts, access to financial resources, also childcare, if we're thinking about the care responsibilities of most women who are also operating economically. The 5th area is aid for trade, and here we also suggested looking at both the share of trade-related aid that is specifically allocated to promoting women's economic empowerment in a particular trade area, and also the share of general trade related aid that necessarily could also have a better integration of gender considerations. And finally, we can't forget about data and indicators of progress. We made some general recommendations, and the technical experts also looked at this in more specific detail in their particular areas, looking at recommendations for identifying particular indicators of gender progress, and better ways to disaggregating relevant data on trade-related activities in order to really complement and support all of the other parts of the framework. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we asked the technical experts you'll be hearing from to think about applying these 6 dimensions of our proposed framework to their particular areas of expertise. And I would just note that looking at these 4 trade-related topics that ITC and the EU had identified, they're a very interesting mix of both areas where there is already a WTO agreement in place, and therefore the focus is more on implementation, namely government procurement and trade facilitation, and also 2 areas where negotiations of draft texts are ongoing, namely e-commerce and investment facilitation. I hope that's been a helpful overview, and I'm sure you will be even more interested in hearing about the very specific findings and recommendations from the experts who looked at applied this gender lens to their areas of expertise.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and let me congratulate you again, you and Marzia, for developing such an important and innovative approach on how we look at gender within the WTO system. I've been a witness to the whole process, so I know it was not easy. We started off by developing a skeleton, an initial draft framework. We worked tirelessly with these top experts in the specific fields of government procurement, e-commerce, investment facilitation, and trade facilitation to adapt the framework to this topic, to apply it to these topics, and then based on these learnings, we revised the general framework. We also benefited from comments, from experts on labor, customs, from a plethora of organizations that were really supportive of this project. So it was a very complex exercise where we really, the beauty of it, I think, and this is why the results are so good, is that we really brought together a number of different experts, and with a lot of discussions and exchanges of ideas and perspectives, we came up with the final results, which I understand is still work in progress, and in future at a certain point may need again to be adjusted and refined. So in light of this, I think I would like to kick off the Q&A by asking you a question, which is, what do you think are the next steps in terms of further developing this work?
Thanks so much, Judith. And it was a great pleasure and a great learning experience, I know, for Marzia and me to be involved in this process. So many thanks again. Well, I think there might be several areas to move into with this framework. First, as I think was mentioned, we're hoping that the members of the informal working group on trade and gender will have a chance to have a closer look at the general framework and also the application of the framework in these 4 technical areas, and will have reflections and perhaps recommendations themselves on how they can use these lenses in their own work, as well as the work of the working group. There is also the possibility, certainly, of applying this framework to additional trade-related areas. Also, in terms of awareness raising and perhaps capacity building around this type of analysis, there's always a possibility of creating other products that may even be more accessible in terms of toolkits or policy briefs, tip sheets, whatever may communicate some of the highlights of the approach and will be more accessible to a wider range of participants.
Thank you very much. Let me now invite comments or questions. I understand we are using the Q&A box. Edison, I'm not sure I have access to this. Do I have access?
Yes, you do, but we still do not have any questions coming from the floor. So the participants may also unmute themselves if they like.
Please feel free to take the floor. Any question, any comment, please feel free to take the floor. And while our participants think about their intervention, let me then take advantage of this opportunity and ask you another question. The The main target of this work was obviously trade policymakers, the trade community, specifically WTO delegates, right? So it was meant to be really an actionable framework that they could use in their negotiations or in how they implement WTO agreements. What do we need to do to bring on board the gender community? So, you know, the policymakers from the ministries responsible for gender equality and in general organizations working on gender, because as we know, one of the critical issues that they may lack the know-how on technical issues related to trade. So how do we bring them on board in this conversation?
Thanks, Judith. Great question. I do think it's important to provide opportunities for staff and officials in the focal ministries within each country on gender equality and women's empowerment, or other coordinating bodies that coordinate the national policy on gender equality, to raise their awareness, introduce them to this kind of a framework. Certainly, it is. I do gender mainstream work in other sectors, so these are will be very similar general concepts and are really built on general understandings of gender norms and the gender implications of policies and laws, gender implications of economic activity. So it will simply be an extension of a lot of principles that these officials and staff already are familiar with, but I think it would be a great opportunity to invite them into the conversation and also to foster maybe greater connections between those ministries and the ministries of trade, commerce that are more directly involved in trade. Also, I know from my own work, not necessarily related to trade, that in many countries there is some kind of a coordinating body. Often it's coordinated by the Ministry of Gender Equality or Women's Affairs that brings together representatives of other ministries, often members of the UN system, representatives, country offices, and other development partners. And so it might be another opportunity to share this approach through those working groups, which might be kind of an efficient way to disseminate more widely this approach. Often international organizations as well as national organizations are involved in those mechanisms. So those would be just a couple of ideas. Also, business associations, other kind of apex bodies that have a commitment to gender equality and inclusion could also find this useful, especially for some of those complementary measures that we were suggesting that would really enhance the trade gender benefits of trade measures.
Thank you very much for the very interesting insights on this. Now I have two questions. The first one I will read it to you, and the second one I will invite our friend Jane Korinek from OECD, who also contributed as a peer reviewer to the papers, to take the floor. So let me start with a question by Christine Sitawa. Is the framework adaptable to different countries, given that some are developing and may not have the required infrastructure and system to implement the framework? For example, on e-commerce, some areas in developing countries may lack the capacity to implement e-commerce activities.
That's a great question, Christine. I do think the general framework, we hope, is very applicable regardless of setting, and we tried to think about particularly the situation in low-income countries and what would be relevant considerations in those, as well as more advanced economies. In a particular focus area like e-commerce, certainly there would be lots of variation in just what's feasible, what's already under development on the policy side. But one thing we do think is important is to consider always the situation of the most marginalized women within a society, within an economy, and we hope that the framework, the general framework, will be applicable to their concerns as well. I think with that, we do hope the framework is flexible enough, and we invite any suggestions for how to make it more user-friendly and more applicable regardless of the local context. But we also recognize the need to adapt to very different contexts, and what may have been recommended, for example, in terms of complementary measures or measures within the trade area, may be more or less relevant depending on the local context and also the particular trade issue.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Jane Korinick to take the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for this interesting talk. I started to type out my question, but I don't type fast enough, so I couldn't get it in time. So you mentioned there were kind of two aims to this research. One, which was, I would say, something a little more of an offensive view, which was maximizing women's opportunities in trade. And the other, which was more kind of a defensive position, which is protecting gender equality programs and policies in place. And so the defensive, we've seen a lot in trade agreements. That's been included already in a lot of regional trade agreements. There are also a lot of provisions on referring to other agreements, say UN conventions or ILO conventions on non-discrimination. And on the offensive side, there is a lot on cooperation. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what else you would suggest beyond, say, on the offensive side, so maximizing women's opportunities in trade, beyond only, just cooperation. Could you expand a little bit on that? Do you have examples? Is there a different way of looking at this? Very interested in your thoughts there.
Thanks so much, Jane. Really appreciate your comment. And I really appreciate the way you've characterized. That's a very clear way of characterizing the two dimensions of the analysis that we're suggesting be applied, and we hope is a more balanced approach, not assuming that trade will necessarily benefit or necessarily harm women, always looking at, what the possibilities are in both dimensions. In terms of more kind of affirmative measures to expand women's opportunities, one area that I found particularly interesting, especially when we were looking at the 4 technical areas and looking at the insights from the experts you'll be hearing from, is the extent to which there are maybe missed opportunities, real opportunities in what I might call the value chain around even the regulation of a particular trade topic. And this would be specific to the trade area, but there are the various trade regulatory bodies involved, for example, around procurement, trade facilitation, and there could be more of an effort, and it'll depend on the country, to improve gender balance, opportunities for women's employment in those trade regulatory bodies, not simply improving opportunities for women as traders or women as employees in trade sectors. So that would be just one general suggestion to think of a kind of either an ecosystem or a value chain approach to these trade areas, and to look perhaps for missed opportunities to expand women's participation on positive terms in the sector.
Thank you very much. Another excellent question from our friend and world-renowned expert on her own, Nicole Peter-Patterson. These are a lot of areas on which to focus. Would you agree that implementation might be a key on which to focus, and what more specific guidance does the framework provide in this context? I would like to remind the participants that for more specific findings, we will wait for the applications on the different agreements and negotiations. However, Jenny, please, if you have anything to share here on the implementation side. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Judith, and thank you, Nicole. I agree completely, and I think in many areas, I'm a lawyer. I work on gender law and policy issues, not only related to trade, and we often forget about implementation. The focus is so much on the negotiation of the convention, the negotiation of the piece of legislation, and not enough on how to actually put it into force. And that's where I think awareness raising, training, capacity building of the officials involved in implementing particular trade measures is important for them to also see the gender dimensions of the work they're doing, and how they can perhaps push themselves a little further in maximizing the gender benefits of the trade measures that they're executing. Also, I think awareness raising among all the different actors in the business sector, for example, so that in negotiations or even reviews of existing agreements, there's greater awareness and perhaps more of an emphasis on looking critically and looking at the data on what is and isn't working from a gender perspective in the implementation of a particular measure. So I agree completely. I think awareness raising and I think monitoring, having effective mechanisms, indicators and data for monitoring just what the gender effects are of trade activities is at least as important as the measures themselves.
Thank you very much. And now, before I give the floor to Madeleine to moderate the next session, I would like to thank again Jenny and Marcia, who is not here with us today, for the wonderful work. For the next set of speakers, I would like to remind you there is a question in the Q&A box for all of you, which is asking specifically from Miriam Mondosha, how the framework can be applied specifically in the context of developing countries and some of the findings in particular from developing countries. Just to reassure you, Miriam, a lot of the examples and the best practices shown in the reports indeed refer to developing countries. I would like, before I share the floor, to give the floor to ask all the participants to include suggestions in the Q&A box or in the chat on which other agreements would you like this framework to be applied to. Please send us your suggestions so that we can bring this work forward. Suggestions invited, please put them in the box. Thanks again. And Madeleine, over to you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm reconnecting. Thank you. This was very, very interesting. And thank you also for the very clear presentation. I really liked your PowerPoint presentation and the clarity of the divisions. So we are now moving to an exchange with the authors. So I'm going to start with Birgit Viol. Birgit is a senior trade facilitation expert with more than 15 years of experience supporting governments with the implementing trade facilitation project around the world. She's currently the head of the Trade Facilitation Agreement Facility at the WTO. Now, over the question I'm going to ask to Birgit, I start with Birgit. Over the course of the development of this Gender Analytical Framework, Marcia and Eugenia first came up with an initial framework which was subsequently applied by you to the respective areas of expertise. Could you share with us where two of the three key findings which you gathered during this process of operationalizing the framework, and in your case, you've been working on investment facilitation. So Birgit, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for giving me the floor. So I did work on trade facilitation. I know that currently there's a lot of talk on investment facilitation, but I don't appropriate that topic. So my first reaction is that I constantly had the feeling that I let down the excellent researchers and the excellent framework, because many of the questions they asked were extremely difficult to answer in the trade facilitation background. So I think it is a challenging research. So if you ask me to summarize three key findings, is first finding, and probably the most obvious for those that know the trade facilitation agreement, is the question whether the agreement itself is gender sensitive. And for this, we applied the ITC assessment criteria for free trade agreements, and the answer is that the trade facilitation agreement is gender neutral in language and would not scale very high on gender responsiveness. It doesn't have a specific gender chapter or specific gender exceptions. The trade facilitation agreement is entered into force in 2017 and has been negotiated until 2014. So I don't know if that matters. Probably now it would be negotiated differently, but I think it's mainly because the trade facilitation agreement is really a legal trade agreement that removes barriers to trade for all traders, and the benefits from a simplified trade agreement would occur to all traders. And I think that's where probably the gender neutrality and the gender non-responsiveness stems from, is from that understanding that all traders can benefit from it. With regards to the second point that Eugenia mentioned, is like, does it have probably a negative gendered impact, or can it prevent any domestic or international policies for gender equality? Luckily, we also found that the TFA agreement would not have a negative impact on the policy space for domestic or international commitments on gender equality. And currently, there's no evidence that the trade facilitation agreement implementation has a negative gendered effect. So that is the first finding. But the second finding just follows from there. It means that the gender lens to this agreement comes on the implementation side. So it is up to the countries to ensure that the trade facilitation agreement benefits to all traders and to all sectors and also all groups of the society. And if in that particular developing country or developed country context, they are underserved communities, such as rural communities or female entrepreneurs, then it is important that in this domestic implementation process, these needs of these underserved and probably often not heard communities are taken into account. So the gender lens comes in full play when the agreement is implemented. Now, you hear me using very carefully the word communities or groups, is because there is no such thing as a woman trader. Women in trade occupy many different roles. They can be either like a single employed person, can be a producer, they can be owning a company, and they can be like a small one woman company, or they can also own a multinational company. So there is not one single women trader group that we could address with, and that each country has a very specific focus. We currently also found that the understanding of where women are located within this trade sector is limited by the fact that we have very few comparable data. The World Bank starts really gathering comparable data on this, and that's an excellent approach. But currently, we really very much depend on anecdotal evidence and very few studies that tend to focus on one particular segment, which are the small-scale female traders in African countries that we also refer to as cross-border small-scale traders. So if that's a limitation that we probably have, there is nothing like a female trader, but there are specific groups that you want to look into when you implement your trade facilitation agreement. When we look at the different provisions of the trade facilitation agreement and ask if they could have a negative or positive impact on women economic empowerment and gender equality, we really scrutinized each of these articles, and we found that some of them might have a gendered negative effect. For example, enforcement measures can risk to affect small-scale women traders more, because they try to be more harassed and they try to be less able to defend themselves from the imposition of penalties that are wrongly assessed, or in general the imposition of any enforcement measures. The second negative effect that we find is with regards to access to digital service. So it could very well be that digital services, when we move everything to digital, women that do not have access to digital services may be excluded from these digital services. We then looked at other articles of the agreement that might have a positive impact for women trades, but we actually found that most of it depends how you implement it. For example, if you implement a publication provision so that you make information available, the way you implement it will design whether it has a gender lens focus or not. The same goes for authorized operators or authorized trader schemes. The way you design the conditions will in the end determine whether small scale or women small enterprises can benefit from it. We also found the same for single windows. The way you set up a single window and make it possible for small companies to to subscribe to the service, to pay the fees of the services of the single window, that determines how well they can access trade facilitation benefits. So in summary, one could say that the trade facilitation agreement is gender neutral as an agreement. It creates legal obligation for the entire government, and all traders stand to benefit from it. But when you implement it as a government in collaboration with your private sector, it is very important that you identify your underserved communities and that you identify their specific needs and you try to target them. You do not necessarily have to target them with measures that I think I heard were referred to as affirmative measures, so positive discrimination. I don't think that this would be like a positive contribution to trade facilitation, because we aim to have non-discrimination. So I think addressing gender lens could mean that you address these negative or these potential challenges they have by creating greater awareness of their needs and by targeting the implementation to these needs. So making sure that you have a better adaptability between these needs. And in addition, you will have to look at the bigger ecosystem. I heard, I think Judith saying this before, that women traders or any group of women traders act in an ecosystem, how women participate in the economy and how women participate in trade. So you cannot simply look at the trade facilitation aspects. You need to look at the entire aspect of how women participate. How do you support them in accessing market and setting up companies, and also how you support them in bringing their products to market. So this also needs to be looked at. In addition, you also need to look at culture and behavior. If you want to address harassment at borders or harassment of women by trade regulatory agencies, then you need to work on the culture of this organization. And I think the WTO is doing a very good work in this area for the customs administrations. And these are the main things. So trade facilitation needs to be seen in this ecosystem of how you support women to participate in trade. These are the main findings.
Thank you so much. This is very, very interesting. So in a nutshell, that the agreement itself is gender neutral, but it comes down to how you implement it. That's an important takeaway. So then I'm going to move to Kamala Dawar, who specializes in international economic law at the Center for Commercial Legal Studies at Queen Mary University of London. For the past 25 years, she's worked for universities, governments, NGOs, and intergovernmental organizations on issues related to international trade, competition, consumer policy, and sustainable development. Kamala, I have the same question to you. Could you share with us what were the 2 to 3 key findings which you gathered during this process of operationalizing the framework? Kamala has been involved in 2, so I think I thought we would start with, and now I'm correct, no? Investment facilitation.
Okay. So actually, I was prepared to do the government procurement first. Can I?
That's also fine. That's
Great.
Absolutely fine. So we start with government procurement.
Thanks. So the first thing I want to sort of reinforce is that, yes, the GPA and the WTO is gender neutral in its language, but government procurement agreements have both a governance and a trade aspect to them. And the findings really suggest that a well-defined public procurement system is significantly of benefit to women, but particularly poorer, less advantaged women, because less advantaged women are more reliant on public provision of goods, services, and infrastructure than others, because they cannot privatize their way out. They have to use public transport, they have to use public healthcare, they have to use public education. And if there's a problem in that public provision, it tends to be women who provide the safety net. And we saw that during the pandemic. If there's no education, it's the burden of teaching children at home fell on the women, and so forth. And women are very much, let's say, they have time poverty. So these burdens really fall on women more than men. And if you can get your procurement system right, not only does it help consumers of public goods and services, but it will also make sure that women-owned businesses, suppliers, are more able to take up the opportunities of public tenders. So, so the first issue there was really, you need to have women who are involved in the design, as well as the tendering, as well as the supplying of these services in order for it to be of benefit to gender equality. So that means, for example, if the government wants to lay a new pavement and road, if women were more involved in the design of that, they might want bigger, wider pavements because women have strollers, if they have children, maybe women are pushing wheelchairs and those kind of mobility. So they might think, well, actually, we need more pavement and less road. So that could be like a gender aspect to the design of a tender. Maybe women would say with public transportation, we want it to go into more rural areas. We want more stops. We want the lighting to be better in the bus because of safety. So it's these considerations that can only be made aware of if women are actually involved in the design of these tenders, as well as making sure that women have fair chance of winning the tenders. Now, to move on to the, I guess, the affirmative action and the discrimination aspect, the government procurement agreement is very much about transparency, non-discrimination, and procedural fairness. And this in itself should help women who, you know, if you look at competition research, you'll see that the overwhelming number of cartels and bid rigging is undertaken by men. There are very few women who have cartels. So you would want to have a competitive system, because that will, in and of itself, it will help women businesses because they're less connected with these networks, old boys clubs, and so forth. Now, I realize that, you know, non-discrimination may seem to prevent some measures at the domestic level for promoting women. However, if you look at what has been achieved under the GPA by certain members, you'll see there are many avenues for promoting gender equality and social inclusion. So, for example, we have under the WTO GPA, the coverage, the agreement only applies to what's covered, what's specifically covered and set out in an annex. Underneath certain value thresholds, the rules do not apply. So, for example, in Italy and in Spain, they have, for those under the threshold procurements, they say we will only have suppliers who have an equality policy in place. We will only have suppliers who actually make sure that they have certain sort of equity standards within the company. So you can, so within under the thresholds, governments can actually do more or less what they would like to do. But if you wanted to use that space to promote women, then you would start thinking in terms of, well, we want to make sure our businesses actually have proper equality plans in place. Now, above the thresholds, which is often what people talk about, the big contracts, they are anyway less applicable to women's businesses because women's businesses tend to be smaller. But nevertheless, above those thresholds, there are various ways that the parties have promoted gender equality. So, for example, you have a choice between using the most advantageous tender to actually choose the tender that's going to win, or the lowest bid. Now, if you use the lowest bid, the price, often women will be excluded because if they don't have larger companies which have economies of scale that can have lower prices, they won't win on those criteria. However, if you use most advantageous tender, you can start bringing social criteria in. So in the UK, for example, we have a social value model which uses non-sort of socioeconomic criteria, and it judges and gives awards. 10% is set aside for those criterion. So you can actually think, okay, a most advantageous tender for us is one which actually puts gender equality up front and center. The Swiss, for example, have a model whereby if a procurement within Switzerland is tendered, they have to abide by equal pay, for equal performance regulations. If a Swiss tender is being enacted outside of Switzerland, those companies have to abide by certain conventions, ILO conventions, which look at equal remuneration. Probably the most extreme, or we'd say the interventionist approach, is the US, which has an offset to promote small businesses and disadvantaged community businesses. Now, what I would say about that kind of most interventionist approach is that you need as Judith said, the proper ecosystem for that to be effective. You need a whole of government approach. In much of my work, we've seen these offsets for small, medium-sized enterprises, and yet the fact is often these businesses, small businesses that are able to undertake those contracts don't exist in enough quantity. So you really have to think, well, we know that we have the women's businesses in that sector, so maybe an offset would actually work in that sector. But a blanket approach, you need the data, and we come back to the idea that all of these interventions rely on good data. So in terms of the key points, I would say that even a gender neutral procurement agreement is good for women in that it creates good governance and a level playing field. And also that there are avenues within the GPA that parties have certainly taken up to calibrate, to make sure that they can actually promote women either under the threshold or through other non-discriminatory means or through offsets where there is the actual supply for that offset. So for GPA, I'll stop there on key points.
Thanks a lot, Kamala, for this very rich insight into GPA, which also goes very much into how do you put the things in place and make them work. So then we move to Michael Geist. Michael is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law and is a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. He has obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree from Osgoode Law School in Toronto, Master of Laws degrees from Cambridge University in the UK and Columbia Law School in New York. And he has a doctorate in law from Columbia Law School. He's a regular consultant for ITC on e-commerce, assisting countries around the world. So Michael, by now the question is familiar. What are the two key findings in your area? And as you may have guessed from his rich bio, he has focused on e-commerce.
That's right. Thanks very much. And I just wanted to start by just thanking Judith and Edison and all the people who were involved in this project. It was a really interesting project to be a part of. And along the way, I learned a lot and was really happy to share much of what I learned. So I know that we may later on come to some of the recommendations, but let me focus on a couple of the findings. And so the fact that I was focusing on e-commerce within the WTO framing, of course, means a focus first on the work program and then now more recently on the JSI. So bit of a moving target in terms of some of the issues that are ongoing. And I guess there are two findings that I thought I would focus on trying to draw a little bit out from what we heard earlier in terms from Eugenia in terms of some of the framing. The first is I want to focus on just how consequential the digital divide can be with respect to e-commerce and gender, and which raises, I think, some significant questions about just how effectively the JSI can address some of the kinds of concerns that we're talking about. So when we look at some of the e-commerce related issues, especially from a legal perspective, and even at some of the kinds of things that are coming out of the JSI, as many of you will know, issues around things like the customs moratorium, around contractual certainty, even to an extent around privacy, have really been the foundational building blocks around developing common standards and legal rules for e-commerce globally. And so it makes sense, of course, to naturally shift some of those issues into globalized discussion, and we see some of those same discussions take place within trade agreements, whether regional or otherwise. And yet, as we conducted the research and began to dig deeper into where some of the most significant concerns, challenges, and barriers are with respect to a gender lens around e-commerce, it isn't necessarily on those issues. They can be consequential. Certainly privacy would be a good such example. But there are a number of other areas that are highlighted in the work. There are issues around access and usage. So basic access, skills development, and usage of internet technologies, of e-commerce technologies, which may themselves have consequences from a gender perspective, raise potentially some significant concerns. Those things aren't typically included within JSI frameworks. There's financing related issues. We've identified from some of the materials that are out there instances where there are differences in terms of access from a financing perspective. So the ability to get an e-commerce business up and off the ground may differ for men and women. And so finding ways to create at a minimum a level playing field, if not trying to address some of the basic imbalances, becomes incredibly consequential and can be difficult to deal with within a conventional e-commerce framework. There's workplace related issues and harassment related issues that have arisen particularly for women who go online. We see a lot of misogyny at times online. Addressing some of those kinds of issues, workplace related stuff, because we looked at e-commerce not just in the context of starting up an e-commerce business and some of the challenges and opportunities that might exist in that framework, but also working within the e-commerce environment, taking advantage of some of the workplace opportunities that may exist. And some of those issues are very real. And towards the end of the project, I'm grateful that we were able to get it included as part of the discussion, given how things have evolved. We also had some real analysis and consideration of artificial intelligence and AI related issues, which of course have captured an enormous amount of attention broadly, globally, over the last year, certainly since the emergence of ChatGPT really captured a lot of people's imaginations. And the concerns around the potential for bias, around what large language models are used, and the potential both inputs and then outputs that come out of that raise some pretty significant concerns. So I start by this in terms of one of the key findings is to highlight just how many challenges we face with respect to the gender lens in terms of equality of opportunity when it comes to e-commerce, and to raise the question a little bit as to whether or not the JSI is either the ideal framing for it or a need to dig deeper into some of those talks and to identify some of those issues and find ways to surface these kinds of issues and considerations as part of that work. The second, and I'll try to go quickly, has to do with some of the trade negotiations and even some of the kind of recommendations and outputs that we just saw from the framework earlier. And it seems to me that some of the things that we might identify are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. I'll give you a couple of examples. The first has to do with the need for women to be active participants as part of the negotiations, which seems natural enough and I think is a very solid recommendation for a framing. The information we were able to glean from what is taking place at the JSI is that many of the working groups actually are led by women. And so there is leadership that is taking place there, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the sorts of outcomes that we might otherwise want to see in part of that framework, which suggests there's great value, unquestionably, to see leadership, women in leadership positions, with bringing both their expertise and experience as part of these discussions. But it doesn't necessarily, certainly on its own, lead to sort of some of the outcomes we might like. So too, the emphasis on including language related to gender, which is an important starting point to be sure. But oftentimes, especially within, not just even within JSI, but when we take a look at e-commerce provisions that are included within oftentimes regional trade agreements, plurilateral trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, we see, as many of you will know, we've seen a shift from what was initially just the odd provision around e-commerce to what has become now far more extensive, oftentimes with chapters. We've started to see some language in and around gender-related issues, and my own country, Canada, has made it a point of emphasis around some of the trade work that it has done. So I think it's encouraging to see that take place. But if we take a look at the prioritization, the enforceability of those kinds of provisions, and we juxtapose that as against some of the other kinds of provisions that we see within e-commerce trade agreements, it's quite clear that much of the language there is aspirational, which I think is important to see it placed on the table and recognized as an issue. But there is a need, and this perhaps sets up well the discussion that we'll have in a little bit around recommendations. There is, I think, we are at the point of needing to move beyond mere recognition of this as a concern, as an issue, towards a greater emphasis on implementation and enforceable standards. And by and large, we don't see that yet in the e-commerce space. It may be that e-commerce isn't necessarily as well understood around some of those who were involved in negotiating or focusing on some of these issues, in part because it is so new. But as it becomes a larger part of the commercial world, a bigger part, whether from an employment perspective or an entrepreneurial perspective, the need not just to emphasize the value of focusing on gender-related issues, but to identify ways to actually make a difference, I think is going to become critical. And the JSI seems like an ideal place to have some of those discussions. Perhaps in a bit, we can talk a bit about some of the lessons and implementations that we might focus on as well. So I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot for this, Michael. So that's actually quite interesting, different angles. What I take away is you say you need to actually dig deeper and find ways around it. And I hear a lot of interconnections between what you arrange in the trade area and what's deeper behind it. Is it actually an access question? And then yes, most is recognition and aspirational, and shouldn't we go beyond that? So then I go back to Kamala. I don't need to introduce you again. So for the second part of your study on, this time, yes, investment facilitation.
That's right. Thank you very much. The key issue here is that we don't have an agreement yet. We're still in the crafting of that agreement within the WTO. So my key findings really are, the first thing I wanted to say is it's clear from the literature that investment in women has disproportionately high returns, very high spillovers, positive spillovers, particularly in decision making in the home. All of these spillovers go into health, education decisions. So it's really worthwhile investing in women. And the other key issue here is that while FDI, foreign direct investment, may increase women's wages, it's not at all guaranteed to lower that gender gap because of sectoral segmentation and what we call cherry picking, whereas investment will often go into the areas which have the highest profitability, and that will often be an urban area where the infrastructure is suitable for them rather than a rural area where we have maybe greater poverty. And it might go into, say, high-tech areas rather than low-tech, and maybe women are less represented in the high-tech areas. So one of the key findings here is that you really have to look at a sort of a granular level to see where women are operating and where the FDI can help if it's facilitated in certain areas with certain criteria. The second key point here is that we have very scattered provisions at an international level on investment facilitation. So in the WTO, until we have the investment facilitation for development agreement, we have a few provisions in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, also in the Government Procurement Agreement, also in the TRIMS, Trade-Related Investment Measures and TRIPS. And we have a few provisions related to investment facilitation in international investment agreements, but there's no comprehensive agreement now that looks at that. But we do have some movement. For example, the EU and Angola have negotiated this investment facilitation agreement, and here we have explicit gender language. For example, we have in Article 5.8 investment and gender equality. We talk about the SDG 5. There's promotion of SMEs, for example, which is very relevant to women's businesses. And we also have this idea of right to regulate and including gender equality in the illustrative list. So this is at the very beginning of crafting an agreement, a comprehensive agreement, which has a clear gender agenda, let's say, mandate. And so this is a very good time to have this conversation and to look at best practice that's happening in investment facilitation at the domestic level to take up to the international level and build on. So I will leave the rest of my findings for the action points.
Thank you. That makes a nice transition to the round two of questions. And thank you also for this. I agree with you. There is quite some development also at the bilateral level on investment, and living that from internally in an organization. That, of course, when you design something new, it very much triggers also policy question and how do we make it coherent with the other type of exercise we do. So it's an interesting time. So going to the second round of questions, I'm interested to know what the implications of your findings for country delegates at the WTO and policymakers and capitals would be. So could you briefly share with us what you consider to be the top 3 action points to apply to a gender lens specific WTO agreements? And let's go in the reversed order. And Kamala, this time you get 1 slot.
I'm so lucky. So I will start off with investment facilitation, just so we have that transition there. Now it's clear that one of the key action points here is about language. I think we all agree that language matters, and it's also, in legal terms, it's a basis for action. So if you have in a preamble, you have explicit mention of recognizing the importance of gender equality and social inclusion, or endorsing and reaffirming those conventions that are relevant to gender equality at the ILO or the SDGs. We really need to mainstream that through the whole agreement and have that, for example, in the responsible business conduct provision. And Canada has put forward a nice proposal on that, which actually includes gender language. And cooperation and transparency. Actually, what we want to know is all of those rules that have an impact on gender equality, whether it's negative or positive. And a lot of this is based on the second action point, is about data, and in making sure that we have those impact assessments. And some countries have done great strides. For example, in Sweden, it's absolutely binding, obligatory, mandatory to have any policy proposal has to have an impact assessment which looks at the gender impact to see whether it's negative or positive. And you can use this this data to actually target more coherently. And also leading by example, I think, is so important in all of these agreements. So investment promotion agencies at the domestic level, not only in negotiations, but they should have a good gender balance. And we've got good examples there as well. For example, in Colombia, they've set up a happiness committee, and that specifically looks at work-life balance, because it wants to attract the best female talent there is. And you can't do that unless you look at this work-life balance. And so we've got some great examples at the domestic level about how to not just mainstream language so that it's unequivocal that there is a basis for promoting gender equality and social inclusion, but to look at representation in the negotiations and make sure that there's balanced representation as much as is possible. And we realize that, in some areas there just aren't the women to represent, but we need to have as much as possible and develop that. So those are my primary action points for IFD. It's about the language, it's about the data, and about leading by example.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let's go around, and then we end again with you, Kamala. So then we go to Michael.
Great, thanks. So let me focus on 3. The first is drawn directly from or at least very consistent with the framework that we heard about earlier, and that is the need for better data. One of the things one of the challenges coming out of this study was that the data is often anecdotal, that the kind of information that one might need to be able to fully assess the impact of e-commerce from a gender perspective, in terms of access to loans, in terms of kind of percentage of the workforce for e-commerce companies, in terms of usage rates, sometimes outdated, perhaps a function of the pandemic that made it more difficult to capture some of this data, or in other instances, the data simply not being prioritized and not being captured in a significant way. So as is often the case, good policy starts with good data, and there is a need for more data around these issues. The other 2 recommendations that I think I would focus on would be one, and you referenced not just the work within the WTO, but on the domestic front as well. There are a number of e-commerce policies that I think can be a point of emphasis by governments, both at home and potentially in Geneva as well. These things would include issues around access and affordability of networks. And so again, referencing that this is not just an e-commerce issue, clearly, the importance of equitable, affordable, ubiquitous access for all is a significant challenge that has implications for education, has implications for culture, it has a wide range of implications beyond just e-commerce. but success from an e-commerce perspective is really contingent on that kind of access. Banking is an issue that I think is really essential, especially from an entrepreneurial perspective. E-banking development, e-banking adoption varies by country. There are some places that are still at a very early stage when it comes to e-banking opportunities. At times, there is a real regulatory opportunity through central banks, through finance regulation, both to help facilitate some of the kind of innovation that might take place in that space, to try to avoid support for some of the legacy providers who are often loath to see some of that new competition arrive. So there's a big issue there. Skills development is absolutely critical. We found is very often there simply isn't the knowledge and skills that is necessary to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. And so that needs to be a point of emphasis. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of thinking about rules around online safety and online harms and harassment. This is the ability for someone not just to engage in expression, but to engage in commerce, but to engage generally online is often contingent on feeling that is a safe space. And too often it's not. And there is a role for governments there, but there is, of course, also a role for the companies themselves, the internet platforms, which would bring me to my third recommendation. And that is to say that there is also a need, I think, to expand this discussion and recognize that it is not just about government policy or even negotiations that take place, but also about what the large internet platforms themselves are doing on these issues. And certainly the harassment issues would be a good example, but there's far more that we should be expecting these companies to do. And they, I think, need to be brought into the tent of discussions and made clear that there are certain expectations, whether those occur by way of regulation or otherwise. So some of it's data related. So when we talk about the need for more data, let's recognize much of that data resides in private companies, is not otherwise publicly available. And so greater data, greater transparency around some of that data is, I think, absolutely essential. Greater emphasis on potentials for bias, whether within AI, but even more broadly in terms of seller preferences and performance is absolutely essential as well. And I think there is a role to play by these companies on the skills development and education as well. Very often, these companies are, in fact, the gateway for many of our citizens to engage with e-commerce, to engage with the internet. They are best positioned to try to engage in many instances within education and within some of that skills development, with an emphasis on expanding the availability and success of e-commerce from a gendered perspective. And so this is one of those issues that government cannot do this alone. There is a real need, obviously, for civil society. There is also a real need for the internet platforms, the e-commerce companies themselves, to help participate and improve both data, skills, and looking at some of the ways in which they operate. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. So more data, expand the dependency on other areas, and the government cannot do it alone. These are important lessons and messages. So we now move to Birgit. But Birgit, you need to unmute yourself.
Do you now hear me? Oh, do you now hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent.
Yes, okay. So on the TFA, and also picking up on a discussion that's in the Q&A, my first recommendation is implement the trade facilitation agreement. The trade facilitation agreement really seeks to have non-discriminatory rules from which all businesses can benefit. And if you look through the agreement, it has language that really emphasizes the aspect of ensuring that traders have easy access to information, that rules are implemented in a non-discriminatory manner. So really take the agreement on the letter of its understanding. What that means is my second recommendation: when you design the implementation, you have to monitor the access to the different trade facilitation provisions. So are they really this non-discriminator and this easy access to these provisions? Is that the reality? And that is down to the domestic level, that you have a way to monitor who benefits from these measures and who can access them. And that's the third recommendation is that if we know that they are underserved and unheard communities, you have to give them a voice. And I think there was one comment in the Q&A that asked a question about representation. And that is where actually the double vicious circle hits, because if women are mainly found in SMEs and in rural communities, they're very likely to not be heard neither at the WTO nor in their national governments if all the representation mechanism we offer them is in the headquarters and require them to travel to the capital and to participate in the meetings over there. So you have to give them a voice, and you have to vary the different channels you offer them to give them a voice. And I would go further on this and saying even technical assistance that is provided is often provided through the central government or at the central government. And we know that, I know that ITC luckily also looks at rural communities and rural areas. So even the technical assistance provision needs to probably look more into the regional applications of the support that is provided, and also looking into whether they can work more with informal associations. Women are often not represented by the Chamber of Commerce at the equal level of their male representatives. Women are often, when they're informal, what we call informal traders, they are informal associations. They don't want to be dragged into the limelight of the whole policy process. You need to work then with these informal associations. And I know of one good example, which is the Kyrgyz National Trade Facilitation Committee, that not only has made an effort to open it up to women participation, but that has included an informal group of women traders that doesn't have no formal registered status into its membership. They really made a step towards them. So you have to give them a voice. And my fourth recommendation is that there are areas that particular women, small scale and small medium enterprises need your support when you implement trade facilitation. Unfortunately, and there's a discussion we have on the question and answer, I think you rather focus on small and medium enterprises than on women traders only, because also male small and medium enterprises faces the same challenge. So if you implement the trade facilitation agreement with the clear SME focus, you ensure that they have equal access to legal support. You ensure that they have equal access to digital, any digital support tools, that these support tools are of low threshold, that the fees are payable for SMEs, and most importantly, that simplification measures that customs offers are accessible to SMEs. Then you're very likely also to serve your female traders. So these are my 4 recommendations.
Thank you so much, Birgit, for this TFA perspective, emphasizing what we can do in the implementation, giving a voice, and the SME. I found that particularly relevant also for other areas of work. I see the same in labor and generally. If you tackle SMEs, you tackle so many aspects. So let's go for the last round to Kamala before turning to.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to be such a frequent face here. So we're talking about the government procurement agreement and action points. Well, you know, I'm not going to restate the importance of data impact assessments. Where I think it is important is the idea that all of these, as I mentioned before, women have less time because of the other caring burdens that they have. So simplifying the requirements for tenderers is really particularly important for women. I think, as Birgit just said, making sure that the kind of deposits and the kind of like financial demonstrations, sometimes they're not proportionate, so they should be made as simple and as minimal as possible to encourage smaller businesses and women to actually tender for these lucrative contracts. Also the idea of subcontracting, small women businesses, maybe they can do subcontracting, but what do companies need? They need a database of these women businesses so they can easily locate them and identify them and bring them into the tendering process. Smaller lots as well, procuring agencies, and this is all possible under the GPA and trade agreements. Smaller lots are also much more attractive for small women's businesses. And if we look at the regional trade agreements, we'll see that actually they're much more mainstreaming of gender all the way through. So the UK, New Zealand RTA actually has a chapter on women's economic empowerment, and the language goes all the way through the agreement. So I think it's sort of working with governments to make sure that the right ecosystem is in place at the domestic level for tendering, but also making sure the trade agreements make it possible to act on the language, because it is it is sort of a gender promoting language, and there's something for officials to actually take away from the preamble or from the right to regulate. And of course, those impact assessments are so important, and they should be mandatory, and they should have a gender lens to them.
Thanks, many thanks, Kamala. So it is we still have 20 minutes. So I suggest that we try to move to request and see if participants want to raise questions. I've seen that there is, we have 14 minutes. Okay, thank you, Edison. I've picked up some questions in the chat. Don't know whether I'm outdated now and whether in the meantime we've had more. That we have to end by 4. Okay, yes, we have 14 minutes. So I have seen here, yeah, there are some other ones. I'll start right in the order that we've had. I see, I've seen that there's a comment from Hafsat Sahibi, but that's who thanks for this interesting session. Then we have Hafsat Dange, oh no, sorry, Miriam Mondosha. And you ask for a little bit more developing countries perspective. I think some of you have highlighted it, but I don't know whether, Michael, do you want to add something from a developing country perspective, or Birgit or Kamala? But maybe we see from the e-commerce side, whether we could elaborate a bit more from the development countries perspective.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Just, I guess, very quickly, because I know there's a whole bunch of questions. I would say first, I think that respectfully, that I think much of the emphasis on the customs moratorium around e-commerce has been misplaced. I don't think that the experience so far has been that the customs moratorium limits the ability for a country to engage in domestic taxation of e-commerce. And so I don't think that the revenue impact is significant. And I think that in order to offer up the kind of opportunities for people of all genders, I think there are real benefits to that moratorium approach. So I'd start by emphasizing that I think respectfully that some of the focus on the customs moratorium, which I think has been really good to spark discussion, has been a bit misplaced. I don't think that the impact is nearly as negative as some suggest. The other point I think I would make is that in many developing countries, some of the large platforms are in oftentimes the equivalent of the internet. That may be Facebook, that may be Alibaba. It depends a bit on what part of the world you're living in. But that really does increase the importance of direct engagement with some of these large players, as for many, much of their experience with respect to the internet, and even more particularly with respect to e-commerce, is mediated through one of these platforms. And so it's not the vision of start up your own website somewhere and find a way to have success in e-commerce. It's working through the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Alibabas of the world. There is a need to bring those companies to the table, particularly, I think, from a developing country perspective.
Thank you. Birgit, you want to add from your perspective?
Yeah, maybe a general comment. I mean, the TFA sets global rules that trickle down to developing countries, developed countries, and least developed countries. And what we have learned, and I think you're currently seeing, is that the most successful examples of implementation is when developing countries and least developing countries are able to customize these global rules and adapt them to their specific context. And this is the most successful, again, if you have an ability to consult your stakeholders and to understand the sector. So I would say that the trade facilitation agreement gives you the handbook, and then it's really the implementation process that drives it. And in the implementation process, in particular in developing countries, you have to adapt the solution to your context, and you have to understand very well. But I see this, luckily, I see this fortunately happening. So I think a lot of countries are able to adapt the rules and don't take a copy and paste approach.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Kamala, you want to add your perspective?
Well, when it comes to developing countries joining the WTO GPA, there is more special and differential treatment there, so that there is more ability to design policies, short, medium, long-term policies that are more development friendly and could be more gender inclusive. So that's one area. I also think when it comes to this sort of what sort of information do we need, in every country, everything is so specific and so sort of like historically and culturally unique. Public-private dialogue is so important here, because you find out what women, for example, what women-owned businesses need. Is it access to finance? Is it more time? Is it training? Is it because e-procurement is not suitable in that context? So I think that we can only really find out what is relevant to the region by actually having more public-private dialogue and finding out what is necessary from women-owned businesses, from women as consumers of public goods, and for women as potential investors and entrepreneurs. It will change depending on the rules and regulations. For example, you know, in some countries, women can become engineers, but then they can't actually work fixing engineering works in situ. So that's a completely different situation from another situation where they need access to finance. So I'm very much in favor of sort of comprehensive consultations and public-private dialogue to actually get what is needed in each specific context.
Okay, thank you. So there are quite a number of questions, and some are specific. If I stay with you, Kamara, and this is actually a question to Michael and Kamara, could you be more precise? You've both referred to the need for more data. Could you be more precise what type of data would be needed? This is a question from Jane.
Well, for example, where are women-owned businesses concentrated, and where are women in the workplace concentrated? And it makes a big difference for example, public procurement. If we were going to have a policy and said, okay, well, we're going to set aside 25% of all of our contracts for women-owned businesses, that's only going to be effective if there are the businesses in that sector. So if you were negotiating an agreement, you might think, well, we have a lot of women working in, for example, say the garment industry. So actually, it might be a good idea if we calibrate our coverage to make sure that, you know, for example, those main suppliers of garments, maybe it's for government uniforms, for example, maybe that's a good idea to have some kind of positive action in that sector. But what is the point of having affirmative action in a sector where you have very few women businesses? If we want to make sure that women investment is targeted at women's businesses or areas where women work, well, we have to find out where they're predominantly working. And is it going to always be in the garment and hospitality and catering and caring? And do we want to shift women out of those and sort of diversify? Do we want more women engineers? What do we need to do that? So the data has to really tell us something to drive the policy. And I'm very sort of wary of, for example, giving broad offsets for any area if we don't actually have the constituency, the audience there, because then sometimes you often get corruption, for example, because businesses have to tick these boxes, and it's not actually possible for them to get those businesses into their production chain. So that's one example.
Thank you. Michael, you have an example of data that would be needed?
Sure, I'd be happy to highlight a few. I mentioned them, but I'll reiterate. I mean, just to go quickly, 3 participation rates when it comes to e-commerce and the internet, access to capital. and issues around financing, especially for e-commerce related businesses, employment and education rates within this area from a skills perspective are all areas where much of the time we're relying on more anecdotal evidence from an e-commerce perspective, and the need for stronger data collection, whether that takes place through some of the traditional government mechanisms or in concert with some of the large platforms that are often quite well positioned, especially to identify participation rates, are several examples of what we could be doing.
Okay, thank you. And Michael, to stay with you, you made reference to online harassment. And could you elaborate a bit what that could look like if you would address it and take that up?
Sure. So an exceptionally challenging issue, and we're seeing countries in developed and developing world economies focused on some of those kinds of questions. Oftentimes, I think at this stage, it does focus on platform responsibility and liability. So questions around to what extent are platforms required to take steps to mitigate against some of those kinds of harms. Of course, real world harassment laws will apply. The challenge is oftentimes you've got people potentially in different jurisdictions, you've got people who may be anonymous or pseudonymous, and it's difficult to identify where they are. Platforms often have policies associated with this, could be bullying, it could be harassment and the like, but I think that their enforcement of some of their own policies is at best uneven. And so what we are seeing, at least in some jurisdictions, are the development of legal requirements to take steps to ensure that at a minimum, platforms live up to the kind of commitments they've already made within their policies and hold them liable and responsible where they fail to do so.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a question actually to all of you, and it's about representation. So the comment is that it's important to have women's participation and representation in the formulation of trade policies, implementation of trade agreements, among others. And keeping in mind the several challenges women face in trade, could speakers elaborate more about the issue of representation and probably share some specific suggestions and actions that could be considered? This is a question from Carlos Guevara. Who wants to start? Birgit?
I'm happy to go on there. I would actually challenge Carlos a bit there, saying like, yeah, no, not challenge, actually, he's absolutely right. Women participation is important. What I see happening in trade facilitation at the best currently is we try to measure how many women are participating in meetings of national trade facilitation committees or are actually working in customs. This does, however, not mean that these women participating in the meeting are empowered to make change and are empowered to really drive a more gender lens. So for me, it's like really an issue where we cannot just take a quantitative figure, say like X number of women participate and tick the box, but like who do these women represent? Are they empowered? Do they have a voice? And how can we support them? Because participation, I'm just thinking of a trade facilitation committee. If you come the first time, it might be totally useless for your direct business. So we need to work with them. We need to prepare them to participate so that when they come, they are empowered.
Okay. Thank you. Kamala, you want to share your views on that?
Well, I think participation when it comes to public procurement, I think, and investment, actually, it's really important that that women participate not only in the design of these tenders, but also in sort of tendering as well, because they know the problems that other women, you know, may have in tendering. And as Michael said, maybe the harassment or the interference that you have when you're dealing with bureaucracy and officialdom. So I think these kind of issues, you need to know what the problems are so you can address the representation. As Birgit says, there's no, what you want is representation that's effective representation, that it can actually raise points and be provocative, and rather just than being a quota.
I'm realizing I need authorization from Edison. Edison, it is actually 5 to 5, and you had given me the deadline of 5 to 5. Do we wrap up or do we have
I believe we can take just one quick question before Nicole comes on for closing remarks.
Okay, no, I just wanted Mike also to be able to have
Sure, of course.
for e-commerce. I guess that it's also an important question.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
sure. So I'll quickly note. I mean, I did highlight that women are playing a lead role in some of the negotiation that we're seeing, which I think is an encouraging step. But participation obviously extends far more broadly than that. And I think much of it does come down to skills, to development in terms of anecdotal evidence that people can find models for the kinds of things that they're doing. And there are opportunities out there to think about which legal frameworks and trade discussions can help facilitate that best. I don't think we're going to have time to get to it, but one of the questions that I see sitting there has to do with applying the framework to the AFCFTA. And that is, I think, a perfect example of a place where, given the discussions around an e-commerce digital trade protocol around the AFCFTA, and I think the expectation and the hope that that agreement actually will venture into some new spaces, that it doesn't have to model itself on the way that we've seen some of the others in the past. There is, I think, an exceptional opportunity within that agreement, as an example, to try to break new ground on some of these issues.
So with that, let me thank Michael, Kamala, and Birgit a lot for this very, very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. Of course, we had seen the results of the study, but nothing beats a good exchange. So thank you. We take that as EU with us. I'm here with Jana in my team who follows this. So thanks a lot. And with that, I hand over to Edison, who manages us further.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. And also the experts for bringing the reports to life through the examples and clear action points. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that time is running out. So without further ado, allow me to invite Nicole Mensah, Special Assistant and Advisor on Gender to the Director-General at the WTO, to deliver her closing remarks. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Edison, and good afternoon, everyone. What a fascinating conversation. I wish it was in person because I would have loved to give everybody a round of applause. So just imagine that, everyone is giving you a round of applause from their computers. I think in a world where gender and women's involvement of trade is sometimes still questioned, it was very inspiring for me to see this week, actually, that Professor Claudia Goldin, a woman, won the Nobel Prize for economics. And also it was based on her work on women's earnings and women in the labor market, which touches some of the issues we've discussed. And I think it shows that this topic of women in work, women in trade is crucial. As Edie Cook-Hamilton said, women continue to face challenges in trade and in accessing global value chains. But at the same time, we know that when women are able to participate in international trade and access global value chains, the gains are huge. So research that I did myself in Ghana showed in the shea butter industry in Ghana with over 800 women, showed that when women export their goods, they earn 2.8 times more than women who do not. So as the DG of the WTO, Dr. Ngozi often says, integrating women is not a social issue, it's an economic issue. But what does this mean practically? When we talk about looking at trade through a gender lens, what does this mean? How does a gender lens produce results? And I think even at the WTO, how can we practically integrate gender into our agreements? And these are some of the questions that the ITC's Gender Analytical Framework has addressed. So I want to just congratulate the ITC for the publications and encourage the members of the IWG to take this forward, because this is really crucial. As I know Eugenia has already highlighted, the paper presents a step-by-step approach to integrate gender equality concerns into various operations at the WTO. And then it also looks at the 4 thematic areas, e-commerce, investment, public procurement, and trade facilitation negotiations as well. But I think members are becoming more aware of the importance of this issue. Last year, we had several members who signed the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement, which is the first agreement to mention gender and non-discrimination between men and women at the WTO. And so it would be, I think, even more interesting to see some further work from ITC on this issue and on some of the other agreements that are ongoing at the WTO, or some of the new areas that we're talking about, for example, trade and environment. What's the role that women have to play here? How can we apply a gender lens to that as well? But at the WTO, we're also going to look at what we can do internally based on the papers and the reports. And I think that we can't do everything, but there are certain areas that we seriously have to acknowledge, and we'll try to do that. But I think, as Birgit said, members also have to do their part when it comes to how these agreements are implemented on the ground. So let me conclude by thanking the EU and the ITC She Trades team for their work. I also want to thank all the members who got involved in this work, as well as WTO colleagues who provided information and research. I encourage you all to read the papers, and let's all try to apply them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for your remarks. And with that, I'd like to also thank the European Commission for supporting the initiative, all the experts, peer reviewers, Nicole yourself, and of course, the experts for giving their time to developing the 5 reports, and my colleagues at the ITC. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon and week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Goodbye.